Winds of Change, Season 1, Episode 5, Victorian Holocaust. Welcome to Winds of Change. I am Dr. Samuel Hume, and on this podcast, we will be discovering how the sun set on the British Empire. Last time, we covered the Indian Uprising of 1857 and how the British reacted. Diverting European troops from the Second Opium War and mustering those sepoys who remained loyal to the East India Company, the British reconquered the rebellious north of India. As troops marched up the Grand Trunk Road, they took indiscriminate revenge for the massacres of Europeans in Meerut, Delhi and Kanpur. Indian civilians were murdered, entire villages destroyed, and any captured soldiers were summarily executed, often in brutal fashion. The old Mughal practice of cannonading, tying the condemned to a loaded artillery piece, was one particularly gruesome method. The major cities of the rebellion were recaptured and sacked. Old Bahadur Shah, the last Mughal emperor, was arrested, his sons were shot, and he would die in exile. By the time the East India Company was stripped of its Indian empire by Parliament, and an amnesty issued to those rebels who had not murdered Europeans, tens of thousands of people had been killed. In the aftermath, a new British Raj was declared. The Indian Army was reformed, with its previous backbone of Awadhi and Bihari sepoys replaced, with many more recruits from Nepal and Punjab. India became a canvas for British engineers, and thousands of miles of modern infrastructure, bridges, tunnels and viaducts, were built all across the Raj. We left off last time with the famines of the 1870s.
So throughout the 19th century, there are repeated famines of catastrophic proportions. Some estimates are that 60 to 70 million people died of starvation in the 19th century.
That's the voice of Janam Mukherjee, a professor of history at Toronto Metropolitan University. In 1874, heavy rains destroyed crops all over southern India, which was then followed by drought. So by 1876, the price of food had quadrupled. The trade networks within India, the trains and canals and roads which, in theory, would allow grain to be shipped from unafflicted regions to those in need, often backfired when prices rose all along a route, spreading the starvation. Millions died from hunger and disease. There were so many bodies that one British witness recorded, "I do not know what we should have done without the dogs and vultures." In 1876, Queen Victoria received a new title, Empress of India. This promotion was mostly to do with European politics. There were emperors of Russia, Austria-Hungary, and now Germany. France had only recently kicked out Emperor Napoleon III too. Britain needed to keep up. There was also family politics to consider. One of her daughters was married to the heir of the German emperor, meaning once her father-in-law died, she'd outrank her mother, which just wouldn't do. So, enter the Royal Titles Act of 1876, and Queen Victoria became Empress of India. 4 months later, the Viceroy of India, Lord Lytton, arranged a celebration. A Durbar was held in the old capital of Delhi, a parade of cavalry and elephants, with the Viceroy and Vicereine pride of place in a silver howdah. Indian princes were granted honorific titles and gifts to celebrate the ascension. It was a spectacular scene of pomp and ceremony. But in the time the Durbar was planned and held, 5 million of the new Empress of India's subjects died from famine. It was an appallingly tone-deaf event, and it laid bare the stark injustice of imperial rule.
So at the height of colonialism, at the height of the kind of Victorian grandeur with which colonialism is being understood in Europe, you have the brute reality of starvation, repeated starvation.
Just as had happened a century before in the Bengal famine, British and Indian expectations of what the government's responsibility was in moments like this were an ocean apart. Most Indians blamed the death tolls on the British. They were the government. It was their duty to provide aid in times of crisis. The sheer scale of the death was evidence that they had failed in that duty. for the British, it was taken for granted that India was just prone to famine. It was an act of God. Indians died because they weren't prepared for bad harvests, and so the only way to avoid such massive death tolls in the future was to teach them the good British values of hard work and thrift. Food, or money for food, was provided in return for labour on public works or in the work camps. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in these camps, and the conditions were terrible. Many people died from diseases like cholera and dysentery. Only the very young and the very old were fed without having to work for their bread, because idleness could not be encouraged, even in the face of mass death. It was believed that, in time, the free market would balance out the price of food. This Victorian mindset was applied across the empire many times, from Ireland to India, with devastating results each time. But there were more charitable approaches to famine victims. They just didn't come from the state. Dr. Joanna Simonow of the Universität Heidelberg is an expert on famines and famine relief in South Asia.
So it is important to understand that famine relief was not a colonial invention. Famine relief did not start with colonialism, but Indian rulers before the onset of British colonialism really already responded to famine, and also civil society actors did, right? So philanthropy, alms giving were deeply ingrained in Indian culture. It was practiced by different communities in India at that time, so before in the pre-colonial period. And it continued to have different practices of philanthropy and social service during the colonial period, right? But really, the importance of famine as a political subject and the onset of the social service movements from the 1880s onwards, which was a global movement, but it also had kind of a life of its own in India, really started to make famine relief something that attracted more and more volunteers, and that also led to a professionalization of famine relief funds.
There were more famines over the following decades. And though the British did provide relief, it was never enough. John Wilson estimates that at least 12 million people died in Indian famines in the last quarter of the 19th century, with a potential upper estimate of 30 million people. The average life expectancy at the end of the 19th century was only 23 years, and the population actually declined. These are events which the historian and writer Mike Davis termed the late Victorian Holocausts. Famine, and the British reaction to famine, will become a catalyst of modern Indian nationalism. But before we meet those first nationalist politicians, it's worth remembering that even after the terrors of the uprising, there was still violent resistance against British rule in this period. Two events in particular are worth noting. First, the Kukah Uprising.
There's still uprisings and resistance against British rule.
Dr. Mark Condos, an expert on British military rule in India.
One incident that I've written about a bit in my own work happens in 1872, and this is known as the Kukah Uprising. Kukah is a pejorative term used to refer to Namdari Sikhs. But basically, the Namdari Sikhs are a very radical sect in Punjab who have a lot of religious grievances with Muslims over issues like cow slaughter. And this is sort of what happens with Indian politics after 1857, is that a lot of the political has to be mapped onto religious terrain. Because Indians are not allowed a direct political stake in the country at this time, they then have to put political actions into religion. So in the case of the Namdaris, they're fighting against Muslims because of the issues of cow slaughter and other things. But they attack an Indian princely state in January of 1872. And it's a very poorly orchestrated attack. The Namdaris, are eventually beaten back, and they're pretty demoralized. But when the British hears news of this, they panic. And they believe that this could be the beginning of another uprising of 1857. So the Deputy Commissioner of Ludhiana, a man named J.L. Cowan, rushes to Malakotla, the Indian princely state, to render assistance after this attack. As I said, he found that the Namdaris had already basically been beaten, they were poorly armed, they're hungry, they've been badly injured. But despite this, he decides to execute 49 prisoners by cannonading them, so tying them to the mouths of guns and literally blowing them to pieces. And this is the sort of most spectacular display of British violent anti-colonial suppression since the uprising.
This was only 15 years after the uprising, when mass executions by cannon were celebrated in Britain, with only a few critical voices. But here, less than 2 decades later, this had reversed. As Dr. Condos explains,
throughout the 1860s, the British begin a project of legal codification across India. This is part of basically modernizing the Indian legal system, providing a sort of scientific form of judicial process. But within these new codified laws, which are designed to ensure that everyone, even the British themselves, are bound by the law, right? This is the principle of the rule of law. Everyone is bound by the law. The British make sure that a lot of these laws still grant them a lot of executive power and authority and repressive powers if they need them in order to potentially stamp out other Indian acts of resistance, insurrection. But what's interesting is that unlike 1857, where a lot of people applauded the use of cannonading, Cowen's sort of actions proved to be very controversial. So on the one hand, they draw unfavorable comparisons to Governor Eyre's brutal suppression of the 1865 Morant Bay uprising in Jamaica. And Cowen's execution also is very uncomfortable for the British because this is after codification. And Cowen explicitly says, look, I know I'm breaking the law and executing these people, but I'm doing it because the state is in danger. And if I don't kill them and execute them, then this could be another crisis for us. So Cowen's execution of the Namdaris causes a sort of political crisis as the British debate, do we support this man who is trying to, in his view, save the state from a catastrophe, or do we need to punish him because he's broken the law? Ultimately, Cowen basically loses his job, sent back to Britain, but his superior who supported him does not. And much of the Punjab government at the time came out in his defense. And this is indicative of what I would call the Punjab School of Governance. This is what other scholars have called it too, the Punjab School, which privileges executive authority, men of action, and quick decisions that are often violent. And this is seen as the best way to rule India, to maintain order, and to protect British rule. I think you can see an interesting thread between the so-called Punjab School from 1857 through this event in 1872, and later into 1919, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre at Amritsar.
More violent resistance occurred later in the decade, explicitly because of the famine. Where the Kukka uprising was a spontaneous event, this was explicitly revolutionary in nature. Vasudev Balwant Phadke was an official in the Bombay Presidency Military Accounts Department. He was born in 1845 into a high-caste Brahmin family, and after his education, he entered government service. Phadke was a serious critic of the imperial rule he was an instrument of, and he grew increasingly disillusioned with other reformers and their attempts to work within the system to bring about change. In 1878, Phadke left his job, left Pune, and left his wife, disappearing into the jungles of Maharashtra. When he emerged, he was leading a revolutionary army. This army was mostly made up of Mahars, a class of Dalits, or untouchables, who had once served in the company's armies, but who had been disbanded by the British to appease higher caste sensibilities. This will be a recurring grievance, so keep that in mind. Phadke announced that until the British reduced the salaries of their civil servants and distributed that money to the poor, he and his army would raid the outskirts of Pune. Until July 1879, Phadke's revolutionary army waged an insurgency against British authority, raiding the tax collectors and distributing the money to the poor. The height of his campaign came when the revolutionaries captured parts of Pune itself, embarrassing the British authorities, who repeatedly had dismissed this campaign as mere gang robberies. Phadke soon had a price on his head, to which he responded, and I love this, with his own bounty for the governor of Bombay. Unfortunately for Phadke, the money was enough to tempt one of his men to betray him, and he was captured by the British. At his trial in Pune, the British officials were horrified to discover that the gallery, full of middle-class Indians, was on his side. They didn't understand it. Phadke had waged his fight mostly against other Indians, But here they were, applauding him for it, literally. Phadke was convicted and transported to exile in Leiden. He made a brief escape attempt by removing his cell door from its hinges, and after being recaptured, he went on a hunger strike and died a few days later. As John Wilson puts it, as the elite leader of a movement to mobilize India's poor masses, which had the sympathies of many middle-class Indians, Phadke might be said to have inaugurated the modern history of anti-imperial protest. End quote. Phadke's efforts reminded Indians that British military power could not be defeated. Not yet. Not without mass support. Phadke was celebrated in Indian newspapers, but few called for his example to be repeated. He was an inspiration to one Indian nationalist in particular, Bal Gangadhar Tilak. But we'll hear more about him in a moment. After the 1870s famine, even the Victorians had to accept that something had to change. A famine commission, set up by Lord Lytton, eventually led to the famine codes we covered last time.
After the devastating South Indian famine of 1876 to 78, so after that there was a commission that evaluated famine responses and then came up with the first draft of the famine code. And then this famine code was adapted across different provinces. And the famine relief codes were improved in the late 19th century. So after each of the famines in the late 19th century, you had again a famine commission who evaluated the responses, evaluated the codes, and then decided how they had to be improved.
So the first famine code, I believe, is published in 1883 and then renewed every 10 years after that until 1913. The people who put together the famine code, it might be said, are pretty rigorous in their understandings of the indicators of famine. So some of the indicators are the mass upheaval of population, so wandering, the increase of the prices of commodities, food commodities. So there are certain kind of criteria for inflation under certain consequences that would indicate famine conditions. Then reports from the sub-district magistrates and district magistrates about such things as wandering, dislocation, scarcity of food in the markets, high prices, hoarding, etc. So all these things are enumerated in the famine code. And then if these are prevailing conditions, the famine code sets up a final test, what they call a test for famine, which is to open, in a sense, workhouses across in places in India where famine is suspected and people are given food for work or some amount of money for work that is to allow them to purchase or earn a very subsistence level wage, food wage often. And the test is because if they draw large enough numbers, then famine has to be declared. It's declared by the governor of the province. That is then informed to the viceroy. And there are certain imperial responsibilities for relief and for coping with famine that are then triggered. The famine code is a relatively comprehensive kind of policy for dealing with famine.
But famine also became a catalyst for political mobilization. Hundreds of local associations were established all across India, set up by urban elites, Asian and European. These men, and it was almost all men, had seen the response to the famine and were willing and eager to get involved in local government, however they could. They drew up petitions, they started newspapers, they mobilized their social and economic resources to try and influence imperial policy. Some, like the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, predated the Great Famine, but the disastrous imperial response to the crisis intensified their efforts. It's worth focusing on the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha and its leader, Mahadev Govind Ranade. Ranade was a few years older than Phadke, born in 1842 into a Brahmin family too, and he was one of the first students of the University of Bombay. His time there wasn't always smooth. He wrote an essay which concluded that India had been better off before the British conquered it, which got his scholarship suspended. His views mellowed as he got older. He still celebrated Indian history and culture, particularly the Marathas, but it was paired with an embrace of British rule and the possibilities for Indians within it, if that rule was very light. He often compared Britain's conquest of India with the conquest of England after 1066 by William the Bastard, which was, in his view, essentially positive, which would be a surprise to the Anglo-Saxons, but fit within Whiggish Victorian history. However, Ranade repeatedly spoke about the economic damage which British rule was causing. Ranade had a successful career in the Bombay Presidency judiciary, and he was instrumental in the formation of the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha. The Sabha criticised the imperial government from a place of loyal opposition, always insisting on their loyalty to British imperial rule, but just wanting that rule to be better, more competent, and more considerate of the people it governed. Because of his critical loyalism, Ranade was always suspected by the government and watched by police. Ranade and Phadke knew each other, and Phadke had once attended lectures by Ranade. When Phadke's insurgency was at its height, the authorities transferred Ranade to a remote district in Gujarat to keep him out of the way. Ranade's career in the legal system is also a good example of one of the major ways in which Indians could affect policy on the ground. The British Raj needed Indians to be involved in the legal system. There were never enough Europeans to do all the jobs, from low-level clerks through to judges. This allowed them some scope and flexibility in how the law, particularly the penal code implemented after the uprising, would be enforced. There were always limits, but it provided a space, a supposedly impartial and apolitical space, to criticise the British regime. And the language this criticism was made in mattered. I mean the literal language, English, which became a lingua franca, a common tongue, across a British India made up of hundreds of different languages and dialects. This ability to communicate, spread news, and coordinate will become invaluable for building a truly national movement. But it also made it easier for Indians to express grievances directly to the British. Petitions, reports, and testimonies could be presented to authorities in India and London, up to and including the Viceroy and Parliament, and published in sympathetic British newspapers. But I also mean language in a more fundamental way, because for decades before the uprising, and increasingly afterwards, young Indians with the resources or the connections attended British schools. The rulers of princely states or other wealthy benefactors provided talented youngsters with scholarships. Students attended British-run or British-style schools in India, or even travelled to Britain for training. Dadabhai Naoroji and Ranade both went to the Elphinstone School in Bombay, for example. Syed Ahmed Khan founded the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College in 1875 in Aligarh. Khan was himself a Muslim, and he believed both that a Western education was invaluable and that his co-religionists were being left behind by their Hindu countrymen in matters of education. As Ramachandra Guha has noted, Khan's efforts led to a substantial increase in Muslim graduates. His college was renamed the Aligarh Muslim University in 1920, and it still operates to this day. Another advocate for education was Jyotiba Phule. Phule was born in 1827 in Maharashtra. He attended a school run by Scottish missionaries in Pune, and he was later very impressed by an American school for girls, and, as Guha describes, quote, Phule was convinced that Western education, with its rationalist outlook, could play a key role in the emancipation of the low castes and the concomitant undermining of Brahmin power, end quote. Because Phule was born into a Mali caste family. To understand why this matters, I asked Tanroop Sandhu, a PhD candidate at Queen Mary, University of London, who is studying the political thought of South Asian radicals in interwar India.
So the caste system is a form of social organization from the Indian subcontinent that has its roots going back millennia. And it is basically a social gradation in which people are hereditarily assigned to a caste. There are different labor functions in that caste, but there's also religious sanctions around how members of different castes should interact with one another. So at the top of the caste hierarchy, you have the Brahmins, and at the bottom, you have people who were in the colonial period called the untouchables, but who are now often referred to as Dalits.
Malis were traditionally farmers, and so were lower on the social order than Brahmins and Kshatriyas, but above Dalit castes such as Mahars and Mangs. But in his first school, he had been taught alongside boys of all castes, including the so-called untouchables. This appears to have given him a desire for social reform, and he would establish several schools for boys and girls, and particularly for those from the lower castes, who didn't have the same opportunities for education which Brahmins and Kshatriyas had. In the 1860s and 1870s, Phula established several tracts against Brahmin supremacy, and in 1873 he helped found the Satyashodak Samaj, the Society of Truth Seekers. Members of the society had to abstain from alcohol and spread education to all, including women and lower castes. Phula saw in the British Raj an outside mediator, which could and should raise up India's depressed classes. This will remain a common thread in Indian nationalist thought. When many of the major figures were Brahmins and Kshatriyas, the social question, particularly on the subject of the lower castes, was often skirted around. Even when the treatment of Dalits or of women was acknowledged as a problem, it was often put on the back burner. The social question could be resolved only after the political question. For people like Phula and later Ambedkar, this was a constant source of frustration. Within this Western education, encouraged by the British as a means of, quote-unquote, civilizing their Indian subjects, lay the seeds of modern Indian nationalism. Because alongside the skills which were needed for a career, like law or mathematics, students were also educated in European history and political thought. To quote from Bridge Carey, they were exposed to the political philosophy of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and their social contract theories, prescribing a just revolution. This kind of educational exposure eventually inspired the Indian populace to promote their own case for the rights and liberties which had been achieved by other peoples, including the British themselves who ruled over them. In the tradition of the British institutions of democracy, this first generation of Indian nationalists had an abiding faith in parliamentary government. Having been enlightened about their goal of self-rule, and certainly not anti-English, for as a civilized people, they were confident that sooner or later the British government would grant them independence. End quote. People who spoke this language of liberalism and just government were often leaders of those local associations we covered earlier. It's not a surprise that many of the 72 delegates to the first meeting of the Indian National Congress were from these local associations. So, I think it's high time to introduce the Indian National Congress. The Congress grew out of this fertile soil of Indians who spoke English, had attended British schools, served in the Indian civil service or the judiciary, and were largely accepting of India's place within the British Empire, but nevertheless believed that British rule needed to be improved for the sake of Indians. Besides the 1870s famine, the other catalyst for the creation of the Congress was the controversy over the Ilbert Bill. What on earth was the Ilbert Bill? A new Liberal Viceroy, Lord Ripon, introduced this bill to the Imperial Legislative Council, and its main objective was the removal of the restriction that only European judges could oversee trials of other Europeans. The Viceroy, as well as the main advocate for the bill, Sir Courtenay Ilbert, argued that there was no reason to maintain this segregation. By now, there were plenty of Indians fully trained in British law and highly experienced in practice. There was no justification to keep it, and it presented an awkward example of institutionalized racism in the, supposedly, colour-blind empire. But the reaction was fierce. Anglo-Indians, the British civil servants, merchants, industrialists, plantation owners, and military officers across the Raj protested such an attack on one of the foundational pillars of British rule. In India and Britain, organisations were established to protest the Ilbert Bill, and newspapers devoted columns to how the removal of this privilege would, inevitably, lead to the collapse of British authority in India and anarchy across the empire. Faced with this backlash, the Viceroy and Ilbert backed down, and the bill was eventually diluted to meet their demands, preserving the collar bar. But the reactionaries against the reform had well and truly shot themselves in the foot, at the same time that India's nascent nationalism was given a shot in the arm. Because now all those Indian lawyers, judges and civil servants who had been hoping the restrictions on their careers would be lifted were understandably outraged. They'd also just been shown an example of how organised action could change government policy. A few months later, Surendranath Banerjee organised an all-India gathering in Calcutta. Banerjee was a British-trained lawyer who faced multiple obstacles to his career, which, he argued, were because of his race. For years, he had helped lead the Indian National Association, the first political organisation which spanned all of India. In 1883, the gathering in Calcutta was the first meeting of the Indian National Conference, and the following year, the conference met again in Madras. Momentum was building. But it wasn't only Indians who were outraged by the opposition to the Ilbert Bill. The retired civil servant, Alan Octavian Hume, had once been the head of the agricultural department, where his desire for reform clashed repeatedly with the priority of the rest of the government: revenue. After just over a decade, his department was abolished and he was effectively sidelined. He fired back by publishing a scathing report on the Indian government's neglect. In the wake of the Ilbert Bill controversy, Hume penned letters to the graduates of the University of Calcutta, urging them to organise an association, quote, for the mental, moral and political regeneration of India. Hume secured the approval of the Viceroy to establish an Indian National Union, and in December 1885, many of the leading lights of the nascent Indian nationalist cause gathered in Bombay. These included Alan Octavian Hume, Rana Day, and 70 other men. Hume became the General Secretary of the body, which was named the Indian National Congress. Womesh Chunder Banerjee became its first president. It was agreed that the Congress would assemble every year to discuss matters of common concern to India, and to pass resolutions to apply pressure to the government, both in India and in Britain. Soon after this first meeting, the Indian National Association, led by Banerjee, merged with the Congress. In 1886, Dadabhai Naoroji was elected as its second president. The men at these early meetings of the Congress were representatives of India's middle class. They were not aristocrats, with long lineages or rulers of princely states. And they weren't drawn from the peasantry, urban workers, or the lower castes. They were the influential leaders of associations and societies which had sprung up all across India, thinkers and speakers, and, increasingly, politicians, in a way which India had rarely seen before. These were self-consciously modern men: schoolteachers, newspaper owners and journalists, merchants, and of course, lawyers. And most of them had entered adulthood after the Great Uprising of 1857. They were enmeshed in the institutions of British India, Western educated, fluent in English, and, mostly, believers that working with the empire was the best way to help their societies. They wanted the corridors of power to open up to them. These early meetings were incredibly moderate. Every call for autonomy, or dreams of a future Indian parliament, were accompanied by declarations of loyalty to the empire. They gathered with the intent to criticise, but very much in a "we're not angry, just disappointed" feel. One aspect of British rule they were very disappointed about was, unsurprisingly, famine and the empire's response to famine.
The occurrence of famines and the inability of the colonial rulers to prevent mortality, but also to prevent the reoccurrence then of later famines. And that supported then also, and to a certain extent, it politically radicalized the Indian National Congress later, right? So famine became such an important topic also to build political support for Indian nationalism. You had supporters in Britain who, some of them being early colonial administrators who were in India and who saw famine and then returned to Britain and decided they have to rally support for famine prevention. And they become close to representatives of the Indian National Congress in Britain, for instance. So famine really became an emotional topic that rallied more people behind Indian nationalism and a claim for self-rule.
There were other, smaller famines all the time in India, but the next major famine came in 1896 to 97. This put all the progress and the reforms to the test. There were now new famine codes. Indian political associations had grown in size and influence. There was the Indian National Congress. There were allies in Britain and Parliament. All these changes did have an effect in reducing the death toll, but at least 1 million people still died. It was an improvement in raw numbers, and for the first time the colonial government invested in trying to keep the death toll low. But their approach was still very hands-off, and the Victorian mindset had not gone away. The free market was expected to do most of the heavy lifting, and so people starved as food prices skyrocketed. Any hope of a conversation between the government and the Indian political associations or the Congress were dashed. Arrests were carried out against anyone suspected of whipping up unrest, and the British authorities were always suspicious of any Indian gatherings. Besides starvation, many of the deaths came from disease. Famously, Bombay and Pune were rocked by an epidemic of bubonic plague, the Black Death. Martial law was declared, with the government carrying out house-to-house searches in Pune and Bombay, with soldiers and police forcing their way into homes of suspected plague victims. Personal belongings were burnt or destroyed to try and stop the spread. The sick were isolated, their neighbours forcibly evacuated. Many Indian political figures initially supported these draconian policies. Plague was terrifying, and the healthy wanted to stay that way. But opinion quickly turned when news spread of atrocities carried out by the searching soldiers and police, particularly the stripping naked of women to inspect them for signs of plague. In addition to plague, other normal diseases carried away many more. Malaria, dysentery, and cholera burned through a population already weak from hunger. 20 years of meetings and petitions and apparent progress had still resulted in more than 1 million deaths, a reactionary government response to criticism, and even more abuses by the colonial authorities. Frustration mounted inside and out with the Congress. It had to change its approach. One of these possible paths was put forward by Gopal Krishna Gokhale.
Gokhale is perhaps, I think, the most important Indian leader before Gandhi comes into picture. And he is, in fact, Gandhi's political guru.
That's Dr. Vineet Thakur, Assistant Professor of International Relations at Leiden University, who has written extensively about moderate Indian nationalists.
And Gokhale was a self-described liberal leader, or in India they were called moderates at that time, who was part of that sort of generation of Indian leaders who were thorough constitutionalists, who believed in constitutional means as ways of sort of getting reforms within India. So Gokhale is somebody who is, in terms of his politics, is very liberal in in the 1900s and sort of the middle of the second decade. He is probably the most important political leader in India.
Gokhale was a star on the rise. He spoke at the Calcutta session of the Congress in 1890, still in his mid-20s. Just after turning 30, he set sail for London to testify on a royal commission on famine. Gokhale saw a constitutional path forwards, and he was elected to the Bombay Legislative Council in 1899, to the Imperial Legislative Council in 1901, and the presidency of the Pune Municipality in 1902. He was also a university lecturer at Fergusson College. In 1905, he founded the Servants of India Society. I asked both Dr. Thakur and Dr. Simonow about this new society.
Gokhale started what he called Servants of India Society, and that came out of his frustration with how the Indian National Congress conducted its politics at that time. So Indian National Congress was basically, it was basically reduced to an annual event. It was sort of annual pageantry that happened. So people came from all around India, passed some resolutions, discussed some things, and then dispersed, never to talk about any of that again until the next year. Gokhale wanted to change it. Gokhale wanted to bring in institutional changes into the Congress. But he was also not really happy with what he called the political working sort of environment, or sort of because he thought politics was like, as Max Weber would say, politics is a vocation. Like any other profession, a politician had to be trained in politics. And he felt that most of the leaders of the Indian National Congress, their actual professions were something else. They were lawyers or teachers or whatever. They merely gathered every year to talk about things and then never follow up on any of the resolutions or never do any political work. So he started this society, which was sort of the model of the Jesuits, actually, where he would train these youngsters who would come out of the universities in politics, which meant, things like debating, things like training people on ethics of politics. And he had this school in Pune where these youngsters would gather and spend sort of 6 months where they would be trained in politics.
For instance, the Servants of India Society was well connected to the Indian National Congress, and it really used famine relief as well as other social service activities to craft the citizens of the future Indian nations by, for instance, teaching volunteers how to mobilize relief, how to provide assistance, and on the other hand, also to use famine relief in a way to discipline the poor. And that, in that case, Indian relief was, to a certain extent, not so dissimilar from British poor relief that also aimed to discipline the poor by, for instance, using poorhouses in order to enforce discipline and make people work in order to receive their assistance.
Another key figure, and one often seen as a foil to Gokhale, was Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Tilak had grown increasingly frustrated by the Congress, but where Gokhale wanted to professionalize the Congress, Tilak wanted to drastically expand it in both its broader appeal and its methods. After a decade of annual meetings, Tilak was irritated by the lack of progress. Quote, "We will get nothing by appealing to or shouting hoarse in the ears of the British bureaucracy in India. It is like breaking our heads against a stone wall." Tilak turned towards popular agitation. He started 2 weekly papers, the Maratha and the Keshri, in English and Marathi. The articles in both papers pushed the envelope in their legality, getting as close to the line as they could without crossing it and being prosecuted. Tilak found where that line was pretty early on, and in 1882 he was arrested and imprisoned for 4 months for defaming the chief minister of Kolhapur, a princely state. A rift soon grew between Tilak and his old friends, including Gokhale, on both political and social grounds. Politically, Tilak believed that, eventually, the British would have to be forced out of India through violence. Socially, Tilak opposed progressive changes, such as the rights of women and Dalits. Some historians argue that this came from his own social conservatism, but others suggest he was prioritizing political independence over social reforms, because he believed they would divide the country when it needed to be united against the British. Tilak became the leader of the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha we mentioned earlier. This association had been growing more radical as the years went by, but with Tilak at the helm, the Sabha put less importance on collecting reports on famine conditions and more on educating Indian peasants on their rights. Instead of meeting with Indian elites, the Sabha built up a network of contacts among the leaders of rural society, village leaders and minor landlords, whose interests were more grounded in those communities hit hardest by famine and tax collection. When the famine struck all across India in 1896-97, these connections bore fruit. When the Sabha sent people out into the countryside, they were able to attract large gatherings of peasants, who were then informed about their rights under the new famine codes. These meetings were usually watched by armed police officers, but they usually stayed peaceful. I say usually because they didn't always. In December 1896, 5,000 people gathered to protest new rules which forbade cutting down wood or brewing palm wine. The forestry department at Mahim was broken into and its records burned to prevent the government from enforcing the new rules. The British police forces suppressed the riot by force. But for some young Indians, even Tilak didn't go far enough in his methods. Damodar and Balkrishna Chapikar were two brothers who, in reaction to British attempts to promote sports like cricket over traditional Indian activities, had set up a club in Pune around 1895. This club recruited Indian youths and taught them the traditional games and sports which the colonial authorities were looking down on. But this wasn't just a sports club. As part and parcel of their rejection of British rule and the changes it was encouraging, the Chapikar brothers encouraged and led petty violence against Europeans, Indian Christians, and Indian moderates, even hitting one of those moderates on stage with a metal pipe while he was in the middle of a speech. Fast forward 2 years, and the anti-plague actions of the government were being reported in Keshri, Tilak's paper, which the Chapikar brothers read. The outrages they read about fit with what they'd seen, and they decided to act against the man many blamed for the indignities visited on the people of Pune, the city's plague commissioner, Walter Charles Rand. The brothers waited in the bushes outside the club Rand was known to visit. After night fell, Rand set off for home in his carriage, and Damodar ran out of the darkness and shot him in the back. Another carriage had left the club behind Rand. Lieutenant Hurst. Balkrishna ran up and fired into the carriage. Hurst was killed outright. Rand died from his wounds. The Chapikar brothers fled into the darkness as guards rushed towards the gunfire. The assassination of a high-ranking British officer caused a storm. Tilak was suspected by the government of having been involved in the assassination. There's no evidence for this, but he did know the Chapikars, and he probably at least knew they were planning violence. Evidence or no evidence, Tilak was a high-profile critic of British rule, and considered seditious by the authorities. He was arrested and convicted of sedition. Many believe he had been made an example of. Tilak was sentenced to 18 months in prison. His case made him a celebrity, and on his release in September 1898, he emerged to a hero's welcome. As for the actual murderers, Damodar wrote the papers and claimed responsibility for the assassination. Soon afterwards, he was arrested and confessed to the murder. He and his brother were both hanged. Peter Hees, a historian of the Indian freedom movement we will hear much more from next time, groups the Chapikar brothers with Phadke's revolt. To quote from his book, The Bomb in Bengal, "In many respects, the campaigns of Phadke and the Chapikars set the pattern for future terrorist attacks in India. Both conspiracies were hatched by men who had a gut hatred of the British people, and who attributed all the country's ills to them. But unlike later terrorists, neither Phadke or the Chapikars had a clear political aim. They killed Rand because he made himself an enemy of our religion, not because he represented the government which ruled India." End quote. By the end of the 19th century, the cause of Indian nationalism had come on leaps and bounds. Local political associations had provided the foundation for the Indian National Congress. From just 72 attendees in 1885, the Congress meetings attracted hundreds of delegates and thousands of visitors from all over India. Indian nationalism had become a broad church. Moderates such as Gokhale and Nauroji, and radicals like Tilak could all march together on the same road towards the same goal. But as we have seen, there are cracks, and as we'll see next time, these cracks will increasingly divide the movement. Not simply between religions, but also between those who saw a gradual constitutional path and those who believed that only violence could overthrow an empire built on conquest. If you've enjoyed this episode of Winds of Change, please share it with a friend. Next time you see them, tell them to open their podcast app and search for Winds of Change. Also, thank you to everyone who's left reviews on Apple Podcasts or comments on Spotify. They've all been wonderful to read, but I think my current favourite has to be Kian's. I feel like I'm listening to a BBC documentary, but they finally let an academic run the show without their hands tied behind their back. Just amazing. Thank you to our guests, Mark Condos, Joanna Simonow, Janam Mukherjee, Vineet Thakur, and Tanroop Sandhu. You can find the full details of our guests and their published work in the episode notes. All research, writing, and production by me, Samuel Hume. And of course, thank you for listening.